In my family's eyes, I have always been the cautionary tale they trot out at dinner parties. The one who threw away a full scholarship to Georgetown Law to become, in my mother-in-law's words, a glorified pencil pusher for the federal government. Never mind that I was 31 years old. Never mind that I had worked 7 days a week for the past 4 years. In their world, if you didn't wear a designer blazer to an office with a view, you simply didn't count. The morning it all unraveled started like every other family obligation I had ever dreaded. My husband's sister was getting married in Napa Valley, a vineyard wedding naturally, because nothing in that family was ever done quietly. My mother-in-law had been planning it for 2 years. The guest list read like a LinkedIn flex, and I had been asked twice to please not bring up my work because it makes people uncomfortable. We met at Dulles at 6 in the morning. My husband's family had driven down from Connecticut the night before and stayed at a hotel near the airport. My husband and I took the metro from Capitol Hill, rolling our carry-ons through the terminal like normal people. I was in dark jeans and a blazer, comfortable shoes, hair pulled back. My mother-in-law took one look at me when we found them at the gate, and I watched her eyes do that thing. That slow, evaluating scan from shoes to face, before she turned back to my father-in-law and resumed her conversation without saying hello. My father-in-law was different. He shook my husband's hand first, the way he always did, like they were closing a deal, then gave me a brief nod. "You look tired," he said. He meant it as an observation. It landed like a verdict. My sister-in-law, the bride-to-be, was at least excited enough to hug everyone. She was in a pale pink travel set that probably cost more than my monthly rent had in my 20s. Her fiancé, a private equity associate from Greenwich whose name I will simply record as a man who had never once asked me a question about myself, shook my hand without making eye contact. We checked in at the counter together. My father-in-law handled the tickets. He was the kind of man who believed that managing logistics was a form of authority, and none of us ever argued with him about it. He fanned out the boarding passes and distributed them like a card dealer. My husband got his. My mother-in-law. My sister-in-law and her fiancé. Then my father-in-law looked at me and held out the last pass, the way you'd hand someone a parking stub. Business class was only 5 seats, he said. The upgrade was expensive, you understand. I looked at the boarding pass. Seat 24C, middle seat economy. Of course, I said. My husband started to say something. I put my hand on his arm. He stopped. I understood the message perfectly. I had been understanding it for 6 years. I was the wife who had appeared in their son's life without a trust fund, without a pedigree, without the correct last name. I had married into their world on borrowed time, and they had been waiting patiently and not so patiently for me to figure that out. An economy boarding pass was simply the most recent way of saying it out loud. I found my seat, 24C. A middle-aged man in a window seat was already asleep. An older woman on the aisle gave me a sympathetic look as I folded myself into the center. I put my bag under the seat, my blazer on my lap, and I stared at the headrest in front of me for a long moment. My phone buzzed. A message from a number saved in my contacts as OPS. Shorent noticed. I read it once. Then again. Then I pressed the phone face down against my thigh and took a slow breath. I was not, as my mother-in-law believed, a glorified pencil pusher. I was a federal judge. Specifically, I was an Article III judge for the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, confirmed by the Senate at 29, which made me one of the youngest in the country at the time of my appointment. I had not told my in-laws. My husband had not told his family. It was not a secret we had planned to keep forever. It simply never came up in a way that felt natural, and then the silence stretched long enough that breaking it felt like a statement. Which I suppose it was. The message from OPS was a scheduling alert. A case I had continued 3 weeks prior had been reassigned back to my docket after the presiding judge in San Francisco recused himself. Emergency preliminary injunction hearing. Tuesday morning. I needed to review the updated briefs before Monday evening. I typed a response, confirmed receipt, and put my phone away. The flight was 5 hours and 40 minutes. I spent most of it reading a 200-page brief on my tablet. Earbuds in. Invisible. Somewhere over Nevada, I looked up to stretch my neck and caught a glimpse through the gap in the curtain. My mother-in-law was reclined in her seat, a glass of wine balanced on her tray table. My father-in-law was reading the Wall Street Journal. My sister-in-law was laughing at something on her fiancé's phone. They looked effortless and sealed off, like a magazine spread for a life I was not supposed to want. I went back to my briefs. We landed at SFO and took separate ride shares to the vineyard. The venue was exactly what I had expected: rolling hills, stone archways, barrel rooms converted into cocktail spaces. The kind of place that made you feel like you were inside someone's idea of old money. The kind of place that costs $15,000 a day to rent and make sure you know it. The rehearsal dinner was that evening. Long table, family style, under string lights in the courtyard. My mother-in-law had arranged the seating. I was placed at the far end, between a college friend of my sister-in-law's whom I'd never met, and an elderly great-uncle who was hard of hearing. My husband was seated next to his mother, 6 chairs away. The college friend was named Theo, and he was pleasant. He worked in tech and asked me what I did, and I said government work, which was both true and designed to end further questions. He nodded, and we talked about the wine instead. My mother-in-law gave a toast. It was warm and practiced and made everyone tear up in the correct places. She talked about her daughter growing up, about the first time she met the fiancé, about the kind of love that was meant to endure. At no point did she acknowledge that there were spouses present who had not been born into the family. I noticed the way you notice a door being quietly closed, not slammed, not locked, just eased shut. After dessert, my father-in-law found me. I was standing near the edge of the courtyard with a glass of sparkling water, watching the vineyard go dark at the edges. "You know," he said, "my son could have made partner by now. If things had been different." I looked at him. He chose a path he's happy with. He chose a path that makes other choices difficult. He swirled his wine. "I've always respected ambition in a woman. I just think it's worth being honest about trade-offs." I didn't answer right away. There was a version of me, the version from 6 years ago, who would have tried to defend herself, who would have explained, justified, itemized her credentials like an apology. That version felt very far away. "I appreciate your honesty," I said, and I walked back inside. The wedding was the next afternoon. Ceremony at 4, reception at 6, the kind of schedule that required the entire morning to prepare for it if you were family and approximately 45 minutes if you were me. I wore a navy dress I'd had for 3 years. It fit well. I was comfortable. My mother-in-law, when she saw me in the bridal suite anteroom, pressed her lips together in a way that communicated everything. "You didn't dress up," she said. "I did, actually," I said. She didn't respond. The ceremony was genuinely beautiful. My sister-in-law cried. Her fiancé cried. My husband reached over and took my hand and held it through the vows. And in that moment, I was glad for him in the specific way you are glad for someone who sees you clearly, even when everyone else is squinting. The reception was where things began to shift. My father-in-law had arranged for the family to be introduced at the reception, a small tradition apparently, where each couple was announced as they entered the ballroom. My husband and I were last. The announcer called us and we walked in, and someone at the table nearest the entrance, a colleague of my father-in-law's, a man in an expensive suit, did a slow double take. "Excuse me," he said to my husband, touching his arm. "Is that—" He looked at me. "Judge Hargrove?" The table went quiet. "I clerked for the Ninth Circuit," the man said to no one in particular, slightly flustered. "I appeared before you last spring, the Meridian injunction." My mother-in-law was 3 feet away. I shook the man's hand. "Nice to see you again," I said. "I didn't know you were—" He gestured vaguely at the family. I didn't make the connection. "Small world," I said. He turned to my father-in-law with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has just realized he is standing near a person of consequence. "Do you know what your daughter-in-law does?" "She's a federal judge. Article 3, one of the youngest appointed in." "We know what she does," my father-in-law said. He said it quickly, reflexively. And then he stopped, because he had said it in front of 8 people who now knew that it was not true, had never been true, and that the man who had handed his daughter-in-law a middle seat in economy while his family drank wine in business class had not, in fact, known what his daughter-in-law did. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt longer. "She's never mentioned it," my mother-in-law said. Her voice had gone careful. She's modest, the attorney said, still smiling, not reading the room. She ran the most efficient courtroom I've ever seen. Half the clerks at the DC Circuit have stories about her. My husband was very still beside me. I knew without looking at him that he was deciding something. I should find my seat, I said pleasantly. It was good to see you. I moved toward our table. My husband followed. Behind us, I could hear the low murmur of my in-laws resuming conversation. And I could hear in the particular flatness of their voices the sound of a story they had told themselves about me, about their son, about the hierarchy of their family, quietly losing its footing. Dinner was a formal 4 courses. My mother-in-law was seated close enough that I could see her clearly. She ate her salmon with great composure. My father-in-law spoke with the guests around him with the ease of a man who had been in rooms like this his whole life. Neither of them looked at me directly for a long time. It was during the 2nd course that my mother-in-law leaned across the table. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. She said it quietly, but not quietly enough. My husband's aunt, seated beside her, glanced over. I set down my fork. "I don't know," I said. "I think I was waiting to see if it would matter." She looked at me for a moment. "Of course it matters." "That's what I was afraid of," I said. She didn't have an answer for that. I watched her turn it over, the implication, the weight of it. And I could see that she understood, in the way that intelligent people understand things they wish they didn't, exactly what I meant. That her acceptance had always been conditional, that the conditions had simply never been met, until now, by accident in a Napa Valley ballroom. That a middle seat in economy is a message even when no one intends it as one. My father-in-law came over to me later, during the dancing. He was holding a glass of bourbon and he was standing the way men stand when they are prepared to be generous and would like credit for it. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't owe me anything," I said. He looked slightly thrown. "I think I do. I made assumptions." "Yes," I said. "I'd like to understand more about your work," he said. "It sounds remarkable." I looked at him for a moment. He was sincere in his way. He was also a man who had spent 6 years deciding what I was worth and had simply updated his spreadsheet. "I didn't say that. I'm happy to talk about it sometime," I said, "but tonight is about your daughter." He nodded. He looked briefly, like he wanted to say more. Then he went back to his table. My husband found me near the end of the night, on a small terrace that looked out over the darkened vineyard. He handed me a glass of wine and stood beside me without speaking for a moment. "I should have said something," he finally said. "Years ago, I should have told them." "It wasn't your story to tell," I said. "It is, though. You're my family." I leaned into him slightly. The night was cool, the way Northern California nights are even in summer, and from somewhere inside the ballroom, I could hear the band playing something slow. "Do you know what the worst part was?" I said. "The boarding pass," he said. "The boarding pass," he said. "The boarding pass," I said. We stood there a while longer. Below us, the vineyard rows stretched out in straight dark lines toward a ridge that was barely visible. Somewhere out here, grapes were quietly becoming something else, and no one watching would have seen the exact moment it happened. I have thought about that evening many times since then, not with bitterness. That particular feeling left me somewhere over Nevada, somewhere between page 40 and page 91 of the Meridian Brief, wedged into seat 24C with my blazer on my lap. What replaced it was something quieter. Not victory, not vindication, just a clear-eyed understanding of something I had always suspected, that the people who decide your worth before you've introduced yourself will revise their opinion only when they have no other choice, and that revision will feel like generosity on their part, when really it is only accuracy, arriving late. My mother-in-law sent me a card 2 weeks after the wedding. Handwritten. She said she had been thinking about the conversation, and that she hoped we could have lunch sometime. Just the two of us. She said she realized she hadn't asked enough questions. I wrote back, I said yes. I meant it. I don't need her to have always seen me clearly. I only need her to try now. That is the difference I've learned between people who are capable of change and people who are not. Not that they never get it wrong, but that when the gap between their story and the truth becomes undeniable, they choose the truth. She chose the truth. Slowly. in a Napa Valley ballroom, over salmon, at a table where she had not saved me a seat at. That's enough for me. I've been thinking about that boarding pass lately. Not the paper itself, I left it in the seat pocket somewhere over Nevada, but what it represented. The quiet certainty behind it. The way my father-in-law handed it to me without hesitation, without apology, as if the natural order of things was simply being observed and not invented. That's the thing about the way people sort other people. It rarely feels cruel from the inside. It feels like realism. Like they're simply reading what's already there. What I know now, sitting on the other side of that weekend, is that the outcomes of our lives are rarely accidental. My father-in-law spent 6 years making a judgment about me based on the wrong information. And the consequences of that judgment showed up in 100 small moments: a seating chart, a dinner placement, a crumpled boarding pass, a conversation about trade-offs at the edge of a vineyard at dusk. None of those moments were random. They followed directly from a choice he made, again and again, to stop looking. To decide he already knew. And the evening in that Napa Valley ballroom, when the truth arrived through someone else's mouth, was a direct consequence of all those choices accumulated. Cause and effect doesn't disappear just because we stop paying attention to it. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to tell this story as a story about winning. It isn't. What I learned that weekend had less to do with being seen and more to do with what I had been doing quietly, for years, while no one in that family was watching. I had kept going. That is the unglamorous version of the story. While I was in seat 24C reading a 200-page brief while I was placed at the far end of a rehearsal dinner table between people I'd never met, while I was told, gently and not so gently, that I had made choices that limited my husband, I had kept going. Not out of stubbornness. Not to prove a point. Because the work mattered and the work was mine and no one's opinion of it changed what it actually was. That kind of persistence isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. It looks like a woman in a navy dress reading on a plane. It looks like a quiet answer at a courtyard dinner. It looks to the people who have already decided what you are, like confirmation of everything they believe. And then one day, it looks like something else entirely, and they have to decide what to do with the gap between the story they told and the one that was actually happening. My mother-in-law is trying, that matters. What she's learning, slowly, imperfectly, is that character is not a credential. It doesn't come with a title or a salary or a seat at the front of the plane. It's built in the years when no one is conferring anything on you, when you are simply deciding over and over what kind of person you are going to be when it costs you something. I didn't need the attorney to say my name in that ballroom. I was already the same person I had been in seat 24C. That's the only thing I actually controlled through any of it. Not how they saw me, but who I was becoming while they weren't looking. That turns out to be enough. More than enough.